far as eminent domain, you're right, 100%. Eminent domain is very interesting. But without eminent domain, you wouldn't have any highways, you wouldn't have any schools, you wouldn't have any roadways.
Hi everyone! I hope you will have an informative learning experience in the next few minutes. Ever had something taken away from you for which you worked so hard? It hurts, doesn't it? What am I talking about? Where am I going with this one? Eminent Domain. Stay with us as we explain to you what Eminent Domain is.
So to start with our discussion, eminent domain is one of three fundamental powers of the state. And just like the other two, it is inherent among the state. It does not need any express grant for its authority to be enacted. The second, it is not only necessary, but indispensable, meaning the state cannot fully function without this particular exercise of these rights. The third, these are methods in which the state interferes with a person's rights. The fourth, it presupposes equivalent compensation. And lastly, it is mainly exercised by legislature. But just because we have established that eminent domain is a fundamental power of the state, it does not necessarily answer the question of what it actually is. So to put simply, eminent domain is the exercise of the state to expropriate real properties owned by private individuals. Now, moving forward, we are going to explain the concept of equivalent compensation, or just compensation. This concept entails that for everything that the state takes away from a private individual, it must be equivalently compensated for, which normally comes in the form of money. But why are we being compensated with money? Well, again, it is because of the equivalent compensation, where the state takes real property. Now, to give you an idea of what this real property means, this, according to multiple jurisprudence, is any property that can be taken, that can be owned, that can be governed by any written contract, or any verbal contract for that matter, such that can be owned, it can be considered as real property. It is important to note that before the state can exercise this particular power or eminent domain, public interest must first be present. Now, to further appreciate this particular concept, I want to share with you the case of Manosca versus the Court of Appeals. In this case, the petitioners contested that public use was not present when the state expropriated a portion of land which will be used to create a monument in honor of the founder of the Iglesia ni Cristo. To resolve this, the court defined public use not only by what the public can utilize, but rather on the beneficiality that it has, or the interest that the public bears. Now that you already have an overview of what eminent domain is, let's proceed to who exercises eminent domain.
Who may exercise the power of eminent domain, and what are the limitations of this seems unlimited power of the government? The power of eminent domain is inherent in the Congress, but this may be validly delegated to the President, local government bodies, certain public corporations like NHA, and even the private corporations performing public functions like the PLDT and Meralco. Thus, in the case of More Electric and Power Corporation versus Panay Electric Company or PECO, the former filed a complaint for expropriation with the Regional Trial Court of Iloilo City over the distribution system of PECO. The court ruled the power of eminent domain is exercised by the legislature. However, it may be delegated by Congress to the President, administrative bodies, local government units, and even to the private enterprises performing public services. The exercise of the right to expropriate given to more under its franchise is a delegated authority granted by Congress. The restrictive view that the expropriation may be exercised by the states alone, without any consideration for the state's authority to delegate its powers, cannot be upheld. Being a private enterprise allowed by the Congress to operate a public utility for the public interest, the delegation by Congress of the power to expropriation the PECO's distribution system is valid. In case at bar, Associate Justice Alfredo Benjamin Kadiwa quoted, "But for all its primacy and urgency, the power of expropriation is by no means absolute. The limitation is found in Section 9, Article 3 of the 1987 Constitution, which provides that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation." Clearly, the two essential limitations on the power of eminent domains are, number one, the purpose of taking must be for public use. Number two, just compensation must be given to the owner of the private property. These constitutional safeguards serve as a check on the possible abuse of this power and limit the excessive encroachment on the property rights of the individual. Now, let's talk about how eminent domain is exercised.
In order to validly exercise this power of the government, the following requisites must be satisfied: necessity, private property, public use, taking, just compensation, and due process. To further expound this, necessity stems from the need of the government to take properties from private persons. As it is a need, there is a sense of compelling persons to adhere to the state. Private properties, as in the case of Republic of the Philippines versus PLDT, it pertains to any real property, mostly referred as but not limited to land, building, and any private establishments. Public use, contrary to public belief, does not limit the definition to the actual use of the public, but rather refers to something that is advantageous or beneficiary to the public. Taking. It is a process in which a property is expropriated. Unlike other fundamental powers, taking in this particular sense gains administrative and property rights from private persons. Just compensation. It follows the concept of equivalent exchange. In this sense, it generally comes in the form of money or monetary value equivalent to how much the property is estimated to cost at the time of expropriation. This is one also of the key points to contesting eminent domain. Lastly, due process requires that in the state's exercise of this right, those aforementioned requisites must be satisfactorily complied with. Otherwise, the exercise of this power is invalid. Is eminent domain final and executory?
Is eminent domain final and executory? As a general rule, the exercise of this power of the state is final. However, there are times where the individual may contest the exercise of this, especially when the private individual deems that the compensation given is not just. This does not entirely stop or prevent the state from exercising this fundamental power. However, it may delay the proceedings. The only time a property that is subjected to expropriation may be acquired is when the state fails to pay just compensation.
To summarize this presentation, here are the 5 things you need to remember about eminent domain.
First, eminent domain is an inherent power of the state. It does not require any legislation or written documents for it to be exercised. However, there are limitations for it to be exercised, and one of it is under Section 9, Article 3 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution.
Second, in the exercise of eminent domain, it must satisfy the requisites, namely necessity, public use, private property, taking, just compensation, and due process. Failure to satisfy one of these will render the act as invalid. Third, authority to exercise eminent domain may be delegated by the legislative but is subject to the approval of the executive in terms of the scope and limitation thereof.
Fourth, the person whose property is being taken must be justly and promptly compensated. And lastly, the title of the property will only be transferred upon payment thereof.